Hello everybody, welcome to George Salis's book hauls. Instead of a book haul today, we'll be talking about my top 10 reads for this year, 2022, last time I checked. Today I'm wearing my mommy-in-law's birthday gift to me. I'm a fan of Game of Thrones and reading, so perfect combination. And this pile is not in strict order. I wouldn't have any qualms with switching one out for another in terms of order, but the last one certainly is number one read this year without a doubt. So let's just dive in, shall we? The first is Bare Heart by Gerald Visner, subtitled The Airship Chronicles. Now, I became aware of Visner's work some years ago when I was looking for Native American magical realism, and his name came up, and I stored this in my mental list, and I only recently came across it in a bookstore, and it certainly lives up to that and more. It's not an easy read in multiple ways. There's a lot of graphic violence and sex, including cannibalism, bestiality, rape, incest, etc. Because this is a post-apocalyptic novel as well. I saw some people on Goodreads comparing it to The Road. I don't think that comparison quite holds up. But, you know, there's some cross-pollination, as it were. But I was most reminded of Mangled Hands by Johnny Stanton, which is a book that I helped get reprinted after 30 years of being out of print. That was reprinted by Tough Poets Press. And Visner, he's well into his 80s, but I was able to contact him, and an interview is in the works. But what this book is trying to do, I think, and according to the afterword by another author whose name I can't recall, is challenge readers in more ways than one, particularly people who believe in what Visner calls terminal creeds, which is, I guess, another way of saying absolute truths. Only a Sith deals in absolutes. But also, quote-unquote, Indian identity. And he's trying to fight back against, for instance, the Hollywoodized version of Indian identity. Even the word Indian comes from dumbass Columbus's mistake. But yeah, the prose is wonderful. Let me just share with you and there's some postmodern, quote-unquote, postmodern elements, because this is supposed to be a manuscript that's written by a character within the novel. Let me just read to you a little bit at the beginning. The last full moon of summer slumps alone through the palmate shadows of the cedar night, and then stretches out over the dark river water into morning. Proud Cedar Fair is a ceremonial bear. He dreams in sudden moods and soars through stone windows on the solstice sunrise. The clown crows trail his luminous breath and thunder voice, ha 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 ha, from his magical directions into the fourth world. So you definitely get plenty of Native American mythology, and it almost has an element of the picaresque, because they have characters who join the party on their journey to the fourth world, and they come across all these kinds of different situations, including encountering a quote-unquote evil gambler, a maestro of gasoline, and cannibals, and people who have been deformed and mutilated by chemicals, etc. So yeah, this is one I'm going to be writing a review of for my Invisible Book Haul at some point. Next one is, what is this? Well, it's my Kindle e-reader, which I don't really use very often these days anymore, but I used it to read if you can see that. A Night to Remember by Walter Lord. And I read this nonfiction book about the Titanic to prepare myself for a section on the Titanic in my work in progress novel, Morphological Echoes. I won't go too in depth with that, but it's sort of an amalgamation of Odysseus's encounter with the sirens and the Titanic's encounter with an iceberg. And fun fact, icebergs can sing, as it were, when they crack and when the waves hit them right. They sing and hum, which is very much like a siren. But this book is very well researched, and is actually one of the earlier books to come out after the Titanic tragedy. And he perfectly encapsulates just how people believed the Titanic was unsinkable, and then how that belief was eroded away and away until the ship itself sank. And it reads very much like a Greek tragedy and a thriller. So it's not stuffed to the gills with facts to where it becomes a boring read. Although a little bit in the sequel, because I read the sequel that he wrote some decades later. I can't remember what it's called, but it's part of the Complete Titanic Chronicles, and that gets into sort of the bureaucracy of looking into why the Titanic sunk, who was at fault, etc. And the answer is extremely complicated. But yeah, I loved reading this. For research, it was extremely helpful, and just reading it in general was a pleasure. A morbid pleasure, though. And fun fact, these books are some of the books that James Cameron read as a research for his film, The Titanic, which, yeah, I haven't rewatched that for research because I don't want to be influenced by it, but I can now see, based on this book, that it's actually highly historically accurate, unlike some Hollywood movies, or I should say most. So the next book is more nonfiction, surprisingly, Heaven's Coast by Mark Doty. This is a memoir. Technically, I only read the second half this year. I read about the first half 2 years ago, and I took a break from it. Not for any reason that has to do with this book, but just me getting sidetracked by other things. So this is about Mark Doty, who lost his partner during the AIDS epidemic. His partner, and of course, many of his friends, and basically everyone he knew and loved in his life. And the AIDS epidemic does not get enough attention and coverage. It didn't then, it doesn't now. I mean, I think more people are starting to give it the attention it deserves. But yeah, I don't know overall. But this, aside from that historical aspect, it's also heartbreakingly beautiful meditation on loss. And I don't even know what I could read to you. Maybe just the end or close to it. Mark Doty is originally a poet, in addition to being a memoirist, and he definitely brings his poetic sensibilities to this book. And here is just a random excerpt that shows you what you'll find if you crack this open. In some way, I had joined the invisible too. I think that when people die, they make those around them feel something like they felt. That may be the dying's first legacy to us. I've had friends who died in confusion or rage or terror, and the living who knew them felt then confusion or rage or terror. Acceptance breeds acceptance, as Wally's attitude during his illness had shown. It'd been easy somehow for the people who took care of him to do so. He seemed to those who carried him to have made himself light. I don't know what it might have been like for me had I not been present at the moment when Wally died, if I hadn't been there to know that enormous intimacy, that sense of brightness in the depths of the dark, the atmosphere so charged it seemed almost to sing. What if I hadn't felt the movement of energy, the leap of spirit lifting from him? This one will make you cry if you have any kind of heart. So the next one is The Sweetmeat Saga, the epic story of the 60s by Guy Gravenson. This is about 50 years old, but it was recently reprinted by Dove Poets Press. Who else is going to give new life to old books? But I was able to nab this first edition copy, which is an upgrade of my first edition copy that didn't have a dust jacket. And even more so, this one is signed by a guy with an offensive inscription that I won't share on this video, but it's certainly unique. But this novel was originally marketed as nonfiction, so in that sense it belongs to the long history of literary hoaxes, starting with probably the first one was Don Quixote, but no, this is definitely fiction, and as you can see, it's bigger than the average novel. He wrote it on typewriter paper, of course. Back then, what else would you do other than longhand? And see the strange typography, the columns of text that almost bring to mind who else but Arno Schmidt. So reading this is a cacophony of voices, advertisements, facts, reportage, and it reads very smoothly. And I think one reader compared it almost to like a Twitter feed or something like that, which I can see what they mean by that, even though it's not the best thing one could say in a blurb on a book, for instance. But it also reminded me, it was very Pynchonian. Aside from lots of wordplay and fun character names, there's just an energy there that kind of predates hysterical realism. And what else can I say? It also kind of felt like J.R. by William Gaddis, but this predates J.R. by about a decade. So I think I can just start. And it's about two rock star twins, Pookie and Paul Sweetmeat, who are as big, even bigger than the Beatles, but they vanish, as it were, and people are trying to figure out what happened to them, and there are no clear answers. I interviewed Guy for the Kaleidoscope, and I'll try to include some extra links when I can, but it begins, "Where were you when the news broke America? When the news broke America? When were you downing a shop in Murphy's on East 83rd, rattling home on the Long Island, watching your dinner defrosting America? Taking in the wash, were you downing a shop from your coverall pocket America? Were you when, filing snap-apart forms, you heard the news? It was 4 on the coast. Come in California, California here. Come in Texas, Texas here. When the news broke Alabama. Can't you get that sharper, Clara? Colorado. supervising the table setting. The Boston matron sticks her finger, America, turning the crud encrusted dial, watching the tube suddenly ignite in a pale blue flame. And that's people tuning in to the news that Pookie and Paul's sweetmeat have disappeared. Okay. Next one is another Tough Poets Press title, Fables by Alexander Theroux, my good old buddy who I recently visited at his home in Cape Cod. This is a signed hardcover, number 62, and maybe I can find, here you go. There's his scribble. And I talked about this book with my good friend David Southard on the Books of Some Substance podcast. So I would encourage you to go check that out if you want an in-depth discussion about that and Alexander Theroux's work in general. And there's also the story of how I helped Alex find a publisher in the first place so that we could all enjoy his amazing work. And I'm a sucker for fables in general, and these definitely gave me the fix I need, like Rushdie or Angela Carter. The energy, the wordplay, the humor, the scatology, revenge, it's got, all these tales have everything, including all these kinds of weird creatures that you see on the cover. So just a joy, pure joy reading. Can't recommend it enough. The next one is, boom, North of Hell by Miguel Correa Mujica, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is a Green Integer Press title, and this is translated from the Spanish by Alexis Romay. It's a slim volume, but don't let that fool you. This is one I did write a review of for my Invisible Books column, so I'll link that. But what can I say now? This is a great book on what it's like to live in an under authoritarian regime, and the feelings of hopelessness, the yearning to flee Cuba in this case, and come to, say, a place like America that may fulfill your dreams or may not. And it's written in a pretty nice degree of voices, and the structure of it is a bunch of small stories that correlate but don't necessarily have a single character. And there's a bit of magical realism in here as well, such as a guy who continually tries yet fails to escape Cuba by taking advantage of animals, including being picked up by a large bird. But yeah, and then and there's a lot of humor in this too. The craziness of dictators. They would put the bird in jail. I think there was a manatee that was put in jail as well for helping the citizen, the second-class citizen who was trying to escape. So, yep, that's one. And I really tried tracking down Mujica, but he really just dropped off the map, even though he lives somewhere in New York. And so maybe one day I'll find him, but yeah, everyone I talked to who knew him just said he's dropped off the map. Next one is Duke, the Dawn Priest by Domicio Contino. And it's a pretty thick little chode of a Green Integer Press again book. This is translated from the Portuguese by Clifford E. Landers. And this was a wonderful project I did. I wrote a review for my column. I interviewed Domicio. He's in his 90s, impressively enough, and this is his only translated novel. But he also didn't write a lot. I think he wrote one novel after this. And because of my project, it spurred interest, and Clifford E. Landers is now working on the translation for that novel. I don't know where it will be published. It might be published through Tough Boats Press. We'll see. But this is magical realism, very much in the style of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but rather than being in his country of Colombia, if I remember correctly, or in Brazil, in terms of Contino, it's in New York. But it's not looking at the city as a whole, per se. It's looking at the theological community that exists there, Catholicism in particular. And it's not narrated by a dog, but a dog is one of the main characters. And he's not a dog priest per se. It's a somewhat of play on words. But yeah, there's a lot of energy, richly peopled, and not a whole lot of magical realism, miracles happening, but enough. And yeah, just read my review. I'm more articulate in that because I had the time to digest it. Okay, the next one is, boom, The Nihilesthete by Richard Kalich. Look at that cover. Look at that. This is a novel that is not for the faint of heart. It will shock you, it will disturb you, it will disgust you in more ways than one. Having said that, it's a great parable of the power of art, particularly the need to create. And all I can say is a social worker takes advantage of someone who has no limbs and can't speak, but has the need to create, takes advantage of him and does torturous things to him. But despite that, he does everything he can to paint. But yeah, if you want the details, I reviewed this, and it's part of a thematic trilogy, the Central Park West trilogy, which includes Penthouse F and what's the other one? Charlie P, I think. And then there's something of a coda that's called the Assisted Living Facility Library. I enjoyed all of them, but this one by far is my favorite. That came out, I think, in 1987. And yes, exactly. And well, Dick was kind enough to send me a signed copy of the omnibus edition that came out from the Times Books. I love this particular cover, and so I tracked down a signed copy, first edition of this first installment in the thematic trilogy. And of course, I interviewed Dick Kalich, and that's on the site. Oh, and Domicio is kind enough to sign my copy here. It might be the only one in circulation as far as I know. So yeah. The last one, the penultimate one is Stories in the Worst Way by Gary Lutz, who recently came out as a transgender woman, so her name now is Gabrielle Lutz. And this is her first story collection. And I have to say, since discovering her work, she has quickly become one of my all-time favorite short story writers. Think Don DeLillo, but more condensed, more existentially disturbed, and if even possible, more attention to the sentence and how sentences are constructed. So just on the level of the prose, this made me swoon. But the content, the disturbing content of loneliness, lack of identity, and things of that nature. There's a sentence from Don DeLillo's 0K that stuck with me because of how nested and paradoxical the existential weight of it. And it was, I'm somebody who's supposed to be me. That gives you a pause, like, is that a typo? Is there something grammatically wrong with that sentence? If anything, there's something existentially wrong with it. And it's that kind of stuff that Gary L. mines in her work. She was kind enough to send me this beautiful first edition Knopf hardcover signed by her with a little note thanking me for interviewing her. You can find that, of course, on thekaleidoscope.com. And the little sauce packets. I like that the book designer took the time to mimic the color of the packets on each board. But yeah, what can I say? Let's just read, I think, some of the first sentences. From time to time, I show up in myself just long enough for people to know they are not in the room alone. And here's another example. This is the beginning of the gist. She had nothing in common with her body anymore, was how she put it. Her body was going somewhere else. And there's horror elements to that, because imagine being in that kind of headspace. It's disturbing, and it's important. So I highly encourage you to read everything she's written. I actually have it's called The Complete Gary Lutz, that has all of her collections up until the most recent one, which is titled Worsted. And I think you'll get the most bang for your buck with that collection. And let's see, we have my number one pick. The best thing I read this year is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. What's amazing about this is that it used to be an invisible book, and it was under the radar. It was scraping the bottom of the ocean for about half a century, until it was rediscovered in the early 20th century. My God. And this isn't the copy I read. I recently found this for a steal at a bookstore, and it's illustrated by Rockwell Kent. His illustrations are phenomenal. I love this artifact because it was published just 10 years after Moby Dick was rediscovered. So yeah, this is on the rarer side of the spectrum. Let me see if I can show you some more of the illustrations. So yeah, don't want to crack this spine here. There's some. And so what I love about Moby Dick, it's probably the reason everyone hates it, or at least the average reader, I don't know. It's that the story, the main story of hunting the white whale, is so embedded in a flurry of digressions, many of which are scientific or pseudoscientific in nature, or by pseudoscience I mean outdated. It's embedded so deep within these digressions that the digressions take on a life of their own in the sense of being the main narrative, whereas what's supposed to be the main narrative becomes a digression. And this is just a fascinating structure that may not translate to a riveting James Patterson page-turning experience, but it does translate into a novel that's almost shaped like a whale, with plenty of blubber to chew through or hack through or try to swim through even. And then the language. Melville was very much influenced by Shakespeare, and you can tell with the way Captain Ahab speaks. It's very, very theatrical and dramatic, and I absolutely love it. This is a novel writ large, and certainly one of the great American novels. There's no denying it, even if someone can't enjoy it on the level of just trying to read it from start to finish. It's a behemoth, and I think now that I read it, recently turned 30, but I think now was the perfect time for me to read this, because I had already tackled Women and Men by Joseph McElroy, which has it also has a very strange structure that isn't conducive to reading in the way that an average reader might be used to. So that challenged me. And other things like The Tunnel by William H. Gass, and even Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. Those are all challenging books with abnormal structures, and that prepared me for this. And this is one I'll certainly be revisiting throughout my lifetime. And plenty of others in this pile as well. So here you have it. Now on my Instagram, which is @george.salis, I asked people to tell me what's the single best book they read this year and briefly tell me why. And I got some great answers from plenty of people who I consider friends personally. So let's just read them. I got my computer here. So Dying, Sleeping, Traveling says The Sea Rabbit by Wendy Walker. Its constant, uncloying richness is why he loves it. They're retellings that earn their keep. And as you might know, Wendy is, I'm not only a fan of her work, I'm a good friend of hers. She's going to be on my podcast, the Kaleidoscope podcast, soon as a guest, but I also interviewed her a couple or so years ago, and I've also reviewed The Sea Rabbit, so I can link that, and I reviewed her first novel, The Secret Service, which is a wonderful mixture of, I guess, the spy novel with fantasy and a grail quest, and very much Baroque, delicious prose. And that was recently reprinted through Tough Poets Press. What else? So thank you for that contribution. And someone else says, oh, my friend Christopher, who's at Christopher Biernat. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing any of these names. He says, definitely The Passenger / Stella Maris by Cormac McCarthy. I hate to hop on the bandwagon, but Cormac McCarthy deserves it. And I haven't read that yet. I've only read a couple of books by Cormac McCarthy, but everything I've pretty much heard of it, it sounds like it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful read. So maybe that's something I'll read next year. And then I'll hop on the bandwagon with you, Christopher. So thank you. And the next one, at Thomas Liam 300, says Terra Nostra by Carlos Fuentes. The disorienting changes of character and temporal perspectives, the delicious writing. That's one I've been meaning to read for probably too long, and it's somewhere on my shelf right about there. And the opening, though, is just famously amazing, and that's something I can just reread in and of itself. And Another one is, let's see here. My friend Henry, at Henry _ Gelinas, G-E-L-J, sorry for the confusion, G-E-L-I-N-A-S. Henry says, Almond Setter's Luck. My first tango with gas, and rich with literary trickery. I have read Almond Setter's Luck as a debut novel. It's wonderful. I did have some issues with it, but yeah, there's a Joycean section, and Joycean in the terms of his Ulysses, not his wake. That's pretty great, and also reminded me of The Brimstone Preacher in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. But my favorite gas is The Tunnel by far. But I'd still recommend Almond Setter's Luck. And then we have my friend Ulysses, who's at Dr. Ulysses P. Psiquatra. I tried, Ulysses. Apologies if I got that wrong, which I probably did. He says the best work he read was O Pucaro Bulgaro by Campos de Carvalho. And why did he choose that? I asked him. He said, it's the funniest book I've read, funnier than Flann O'Brien, his work, The Third Policeman, and with tons of linguistic playfulness, probably in the realm of the untranslatable. Amazing book. Well, Bottom's Dream by Arno Schmidt is the untranslatable novel, and yet it was translated by Johnny Woods. So maybe there's a heroic translator out there who can translate this one. And then, let's see. Someone recommends They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us. And there's no author there, so I have to look that up. The author is Hanif Abdurraqib, and this is recommended by There's No Place Like Tome. And I asked why. He said, Abdurraqib uses essays about music, politics, and Thanksgiving in-law visits to reveal how the universal is personal and vice versa. He also has a mastery of tone, being pithy to set you up for the next paragraph where he shows you a new way for your heart to break. Ultimately, one comes away from his book with hope and probably some new album recommendations. So yeah, an essay collection. You don't encounter those very much as far as best books of the year, so thank you for that cool recommendation. And then my friend Richard Schober from Tough Poets Press, he recommends and says the best read of the year for him was Two-Way Traffic by Joel Leiber. And I asked him to elaborate, and he said, I'm horrible at reviewing books. This was Leiber's last novel, semi-autobiographical and written as journal entries about his battle with depression. It's depressing as hell, but not without some humor and optimism. He committed suicide by jumping out of a window the day after he submitted his final revisions to his agent, which reminds me of David Foster Wallace, who hanged himself after he set up what probably would not have been the final version of The Pale King on his desk, highlighted by the light of his desk lamp. And yeah, depression sucks, to say the least. And Richard goes on to say, it's a hard one to find. I'm working on getting his kids on board for a reissue. Check out his Wikipedia page when you get a chance. Okay, so we're almost done here with the recommendations. At Favntag, Favntag, says, Lonesome Dove, due to the unforgettable cast of characters. And that's by Larry McMurtry. Yep. McMurtry. Lonesome Dove, Larry McMurtry. Yeah, I've seen that around. I'm not the biggest fan of genre period, but also not the biggest fan of Western genre pieces of art. But I like a handful of Westerns, Western films. I haven't even read a Western, I don't think. But if I ever decide I want to, I'll read The Lonesome Dove. So thank you for that recommendation. And at Gestel7 says, The Adventures and Misadventures of Joan Orpy, because it was laugh out loud funny on a Quixotean level. And the author is Max Bisora. I think it's translated. Okay, it was translated from the Catalan, ooh, exotic, by Mara Fay Leatham. And I have seen this floating around the internet, and I was interested in it, but you know, too much to read, too little time. It was published by Open Letter, which is a great press and does great work for literature, translated literature in particular. And I believe I got them all. Let's see. Oh, at Myers Megafictional Musings, says Duncanville's Cat. I sent him a message asking him to elaborate, but it says he saw it, but he didn't say why. So he's probably at a loss for words, and I don't blame him. It's an amazing novel, Duncanville's Cat, by Alexander Theroux, and definitely in my top 10 of all time. And I'll just link my review, because what else can I say other than it takes the concept of unrequited love, a kind of minimalist story, and just blows it to the proportions of a maximalist storytelling experience. So yeah, tell me, what's the single best book you read this year, or what are some of your top 10 books, if you want to go out of your way to write that many titles for me and for others to see in the comments. So thanks so much for watching this video, and hope you have a great holiday season. Hope you have a great new year and beyond. See you next time.